How's it going? This is Mr. Lissard bringing you your 519 distance learning assignment. In this class, we are going to be looking at food webs. And as you can see, this is the same visual that is contained in your textbook. So this is going to be an example that we're going to be using. While you're going through this class, you are also going to be answering the 10 questions that appear on Microsoft Forms. All right, we are going to be going through these questions as they relate to these pictures. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a minute. Before we get there, we're going to watch a little bit of this video, just the first couple of minutes, and we're going to talk about something called a keystone species. Okay, so here we go.
Ecosystems are large areas on our planet that contain both living and non-living material. A great example could be these giant kelp forests. The kelp are producers, so they're taking energy from the sun and converting that into food, which is eaten by herbivores like this sea urchin, which in turn are eaten by carnivores like this sea otter. Now the problem with the sea otter is if it dies due to hunting or predation, then the sea urchin populations will take off. Sea urchins feed on kelp by trimming the bottom, and sometimes the kelp will simply float away. And so if you have too many sea urchins, you get what are called urchin barrens, where there are no kelp, and therefore the whole ecosystem kind of folds in on itself. And so we like to think of the otter as a keystone species.
Okay, so this is similar to what we read in our textbook, not necessarily about keystone species, but about invasive species. And just as there is a delicate balance in this otter and urchin kelp ecosystem, where if the otter is not there to eat the urchin, then the urchin will overeat the kelp and cause it to crash its population. So as we saw that in the book with the zebra mussel causing there to be ripple effects in our food web, we're seeing these same ripple effects happen if the otter were to disappear. And so we're going to get this little keystone species analogy. This little arch piece in any stone arch is called a keystone, and that is why it is called a keystone species.
Just like on this arch, this keystone at the top holds everything else in place. You can think of each of these stones now as a different species. If we remove that keystone species, then the whole thing folds in on itself. In other words, some species are actually more important than others. Before we get to ecosystems, we should understand how life is organized. From the very small, one individual, for example, sea urchin, is in part of what's called a population, or all the sea urchins in an area. We then take all the populations together, that's a community. We then add the non-living material, that's an ecosystem, and then we even have larger areas which are called the biomes. What's larger than the biomes? That's going to be the biosphere. It's going to be our planet. And so before we get to ecosystems, we'll start by studying the major biomes, both terrestrial or land-based and aquatic, those in the land. We'll then move on to the interactions at the ecosystem level. So that's going to be all of the producers and consumers interacting. A good way to study that is going to be with their food webs. We're also going to add abiotic or non-living material. We'll then jump to individuals and the role of a niche or a niche. That's going to be the job that an individual has. We'll then move to the importance of keystone species diversity, and then finally edge effects.
Okay, so this is a little, just a diagram for you guys to think about how these concepts fit together. And we're not going to get into edge effects. We are going to talk about how diversity can be affected by the disappearance or introduction of keystone species, how diversity relates to having a certain number of producers, a certain number of consumers, and how every organism in a food web has a niche, where if it were removed, there would be these ripple effects, which he calls edge effects, and I'm going to call ripple effects, because I see it more as a drop creating a wave that affects other things further away from them. Okay, so that is sort of an overview of what we're doing. As you watch this video is going to do two things. First of all, it is going to guide you through the pieces of our classwork today. And second of all, it is going to give you a little bit of introduction or information about how to complete your food web if you have not already done so. So, close this out. Once again, remember you can access these questions on Microsoft Forms. I've posted the link in Teams right here in all of your teams. And they accompany these questions. And so I've renumbered them 1, 2, 3. Question 4 is actually question 1. So we're going to start here. Okay? So what I'd like us to do is think about these 3 questions and pause the video here and take as much time as you need to complete these 3 questions. Okay? I'll be back after the pause. All right, so you've paused, you've thought about these questions, you've divided our producers and consumers, and you're going to see that our producers here are at the bottom. They are our plants. They are the ones that do photosynthesis. And our consumers are actually the ones that consume or eat. And there are a few things that are missing from this food web since we don't have a food web that ends with a human or a grizzly bear or a marten. These things will die and eventually their nutrients will be cycled back to the producers by decomposers. We also don't see the sun in this food web, which is, of course, where most of our energy on the planet starts. Essentially, all that energy that's coming from these photosynthetic organisms definitely starts in the sun. Number 3, you may have been a little confused here, but you can see that there is no arrow to the salmon. The salmon does not eat any of these species. The salmon eats other things, and apparently those things don't exist in this food web. And as you may know, salmon are organisms that travel upstream to go to their breeding grounds, and that is where they would be eaten by grizzly bears. They might not be eating along this way, and I don't see any evidence of that. So that's just one thing that you might have observed here. There's no arrow pointing to the salmon. The salmon doesn't seem to eat anything in this food web. Okay, so moving on to the second picture. And once again, we're going to go ahead and analyze this, pause, and complete these questions on your own. All right, so we're back from a pause here. We discussed keystone species at the beginning of this video, and we talked about them as a very important species in a food web that would cause lots of ripple effects and negative ripple effects if they were removed. I have picked 2 possible keystone species in this food web. I have chosen the mouse or the short-tailed vole, and the reason why I've chosen those 2 is they have the most arrows coming and going from them, right? Not only do they eat multiple things, here the vole eats the grass and the blackberry, but many things eat them as well. And so though the food sources of these animals would be seriously impacted if the vole was to be removed. Also, the grass and the blackberry populations would be affected. I think the vole is even more of a keystone species than the mouse because you can see it eats 2 different things and is eaten by 3 different things. It has 5 arrows that come in and out. And it would have serious effects if this species were removed from this food web. Number 3, how might the caterpillar population be affected by a serious reduction in the aphids in the ecosystem? This is a very interesting question because there's 2 things going on here. The caterpillar population is competing with the aphids for this resource, this nettle plant. However, they're both food for the bird here, the blue titmouse. So the caterpillar and the aphid are the only food sources here. So if the aphids were seriously reduced, then the bird would have to eat only caterpillars. And so although there would be more food for the caterpillars, there would also be more predators for the caterpillars. And so it would be hard to tell exactly what would happen, but at first, most likely the caterpillar population would increase until the point where the bird can find them easily and start eating them. However, you would see there would be a huge issue with the ladybug, which is actually written here as ladybird, as they would have no more food sources. Finally, what might happen to the grass population if all of the foxes die? And at first thought, you might think, well, nothing really, because the fox doesn't eat the grass. It has nothing to do with it. But a food web teaches us that everything's connected. And as you can see, if all the foxes die, the rabbit population is going to skyrocket. There will have no natural predators. And therefore, the grass is going to get overeaten because there's going to be too many rabbits, which could then affect the short-tailed field vole because it won't have enough grass to eat, and it could cause a lot of ripple effects. But just this fox being removed would have an effect on the grass, even though they're not directly linked. All right, moving on to our last section here. This is a food pyramid, and it shows the amount of energy in the organisms at every level. And we can see that here in this diagram, the bottom of the pyramid is, of course, the widest, and it has the most energy. So as you think about what this diagram looks like, you're going to pause the video, answer the 3 questions, and I'll see you right after the pause. Okay, so what must be true about the number of herbivores in this ecosystem compared to the number of carnivores? Now, because there is more energy available at the herbivore level, there are going to be more herbivores. If there were the same number of herbivores as carnivores, the carnivores would not have enough energy to eat. So, what's true about herbivores is there always need to be a greater number of them than there are carnivores. Number 2, when an animal eats another organism, some energy is lost. Where did that energy go? Well, when the squirrel eats nuts from the plant, most of the energy from that plant was used to create those nuts, but some energy was also used to grow the plant, or grow leaves, or grow bark, or things that the animal is not eating. When the squirrel gets eaten by the snake, this snake doesn't get all of the energy from that tree because the squirrel had to move around and used some of its energy on moving and breathing and finding food. And so some of that energy is going to be lost, which is why this pyramid gets narrower and narrower at the top. And so when the fox, if it eats the snake or another carnivore here, it's going to, again, lose a little bit of energy because every animal that eats has to use some of that energy to survive. And that energy that it's used is then lost. So this is a good model of energy in an ecosystem because it shows that, how energy is getting narrower and narrower, and it's getting concentrated into fewer numbers of organisms. And so that is why there are fewer number of top carnivores compared to the amount of grass, or the amount of trees, the amount of herbivores. And so I hope this was all helpful. We're going to have you submit those Microsoft forms. I'm going to check to see how we did. And then we're going to move on to our food web, which you may have started, you may not have started. So on Microsoft Teams, I am asking that you complete this assignment, this 518 distance learning. And today's class, you were supposed to get some guided practice on how to set up and create these food webs. Tomorrow, you're going to be just completing those food webs. And then on Thursday, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. So in this document, you would have found this document here, the Lake Michigan Organism Sets Color Single-Sided. If you click on that, you get these pictures. And so if you want to do this on the computer, which is what I did, you can use a tool called the snipping tool, which you should have on your computer. And this snipping tool allows you to take screenshots. You press New, you press New, you square off something, and then you have it. And what I've done here is I've just right-clicked, copied, and I've moved them into Microsoft Paint. Now, I didn't do them one at a time, I did them a whole page at a time, but I've cut them out and I've been able to paste them in here. Okay? And so now, using the Microsoft Paint features, I'm able to move these things around. I'm able to make arrows like this. right? Or I can find the actual arrow function, right? And I can rotate it around. I can build this here in Microsoft Paint. If you'd rather do this on a piece of paper and take a picture of it and then upload it to Microsoft Teams, that's fine. But using this feature, you should be able to quickly organize them into a food web. And so as you finish this, you're going to just make sure you put the arrows. Remember that the arrows would face from the thing that is eating to the thing that eats it, right? So the vole gets eaten by the fox. Why does the arrow point this way? Well, the arrow is pointing to show the flow of energy, right? So if we start here with the sun, we're not going to have an arrow that points to the sun. We're going to have an arrow that points away from the sun, and it's going to point to the algae. And so this can be a little bit, you're going to get a little stuff in the way, so you have to move it out of the way, but this shouldn't be too hard. I'm not looking for anything too pretty. I'm just looking for some arrows pointing to the right things, organizing this food web. If you think it will be easier to do it on paper and you have the resources to do that, then do that. But try to make it have some pictures, maybe, not as detailed as this, but don't just write the word yellow perch, draw a fish or something. So you remember that the yellow perch is a fish and how big it is, etc., etc. Okay, so that is basically all I'm looking for you to do today. I want you to complete that Microsoft Forms, and I want you to complete your food web. Submit the Microsoft Forms when you're done, and go ahead and email me, or what would be my preference would be to submit it directly on Teams. You should be able to upload it right with the other documents here on Teams. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for coming to class and getting smart.